say, here's a lesson you don't get. I said, I loop the loop when I get loose. I said, ignition, ignite your night out.
Hello and welcome back to the Not Fade Away podcast. I am your host, Margot D. Thanks for dropping by. Follow all of my social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. And for comments and suggestions, feel free to email me at notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. This is the show that pays homage to the people and events in the music world that will never be forgotten. I'm really excited about this interview because I just heard about Dorothy Carvello's book recently in the New York Times. I read a review. It was a rave review, so I instantly got it, put it on my Kindle, and I read it in one sitting, which hasn't happened in a long time. The title of Dorothy's book, by the way, is Anything for a Hit, an A&R woman's story of surviving the music industry. Dorothy is a 30-year music industry veteran, and you're going to love this interview because she calls out all of the awful behavior of many of the men she worked with throughout her illustrious career. So we talk about how she got started. We talk about what an A&R person actually does and how the title was abused by many folks for decades. Her personal struggle as a woman in a male-dominated industry. Why she thinks 2019 is going to be the Me Too movement year for the music industry. Plus, we talk about the murder of her friend, record promoter Charlie Minor, which happened in 1995. And we also talk about her love affair with Michael Hutchence of In Excess, who sadly died by suicide in 1997. By the way, Dorothy personally told me that it was okay for me to tell you guys that Michael was great in the sack. I forgot to ask her about that in the interview. She also gives her reasons why she thinks the HBO series Vinyl, which was supposed to be all about the record industry in the 70s, why that didn't really connect with audiences. You can find Dorothy yourself at anythingforahitbook.com. Her email's there, so you guys can contact her yourself. She's also on social media at D Carvello, and that's DCarvello. And I want to apologize ahead of time. We conducted the interview with her cell phone, and sometimes the service wasn't that great, but I think you're going to get all you need to hear. It's a really fantastic interview. You're just going to love her lack of guile and bullshit. She's got great stories to tell. You guys need to listen to this interview, and then please get her book right away. It's also available as an audiobook. Remember that. Also, guys, please don't forget to subscribe to the show so you won't miss any episodes coming up. And my next episode is going to be really cool. It's going to be all about the tragedy at Altamont, and I've got some great interviews lined up. So please stay subscribed to the Not Fade Away podcast. All right, everyone, let's get into this interview today with Dorothy Carvello. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have to tell you, you were one of those books that like Gone Girl, once I started, I couldn't put it down. I really enjoyed reading it so much. It's called Anything for a Hit, an A&R woman's story of surviving the music industry. So I saw the review in the New York Times, which was very good. And so I had to check it out for myself. So congratulations. First, I just want to say congratulations for the book.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your compliment. I wrote the book in mind of it being a very funny, easy read, even though it deals with serious topics.
Well, you did your job. So can you just give us a little bit of background? And let me see, you originally wanted to work for the FBI?
Yes, I did. As a kid growing up in Brooklyn, besides it being a steady job where you got a pension back then, I really believed that there were two ways to look at life and people, either the good or the bad. There was no gray in between. When I worked in the music business, I began to identify with the people that are actually of the criminal element, even though, they wear suits and ties. The way they think is actually, like sociopaths. So either way, I kind of got my wish. I didn't go into law enforcement, but I got to deal with the, deviant behavior. And that always interests me, how people could let their morality go, and myself included. So.
Well, tell us about your first job. I mean, how did you get it? And then just please give us a background of Ahmet Erdogan.
Well, my first job, I loved music, and I used to sneak out and go to clubs when I was in high school in Bensonhurst, and then eventually I got into going to the clubs in Manhattan, the Electric Circuit, Paradise Garage. So I love dance music. I love to dance, and I was interested in, the music business. How do you hear about these records? So I decided, well, when I was in college, I read an article in the paper, and I didn't know anyone in the music business, and I read about this man, Ahmet Ertegun, who founded Atlantic Records. So I figured, well, if I'm going to start, I might as well start at the top. And I had a friend in politics who knew Ahmet gave campaign contributions to this congressman in Brooklyn because he was Turkish, and he believed in supporting, the causes of keeping Turkey free and open. And at the time, they were at war with Cyprus. So anyway, I worked on this guy's campaign, and eventually he introduced me to Ahmet Ertegun. And eventually I got a job there as his secretary. I couldn't type or take dictation, but I lied, and I figured, just get a foot in the door, and, they'll have something for me to do. Little did I know that access to Ahmet Ertegun would lead me down a path of, adventure, excitement, but also very abusive workplace environment. But back then, for women, there were no women. It wasn't categorized as abuse or harassment. It was just something that you had to do if you wanted to work in the music business at the time. So, and if you complained, you got fired. That was it. And which I did get fired many times in the course of my career, and blackballed by these powerful men.
Who were some of the biggest artists then when you were working for him?
The biggest artists at the time that were happening, there were so many. I mean, Debbie Gibson, Genesis, Phil Collins solo, even Led Zeppelin, they weren't recording, but the reissues, In Excess, Alana Miles. It was at the time in the late 80s when the CD had just come out. So they were recording vinyl music into CD. So they were making so much money of any artist, you were now going to go out and buy a CD of the same record. So the business was awash with cash, and a lot of the cash, was used for illegal activities such as prostitution, drugs. The men just did whatever they wanted. And as employees of a publicly traded corporation, they had no regard not only for stockholders, but for employees. Employees had no recourse to even grow as employees or have any, complaint if you didn't.
I'm sorry, if you cut off there. So even if you complained?
If you complained, you had no recourse in terms of they had human resources, but human resources was really there just to protect these men and the corporation. They didn't help an employee become women. Women were just relegated to serve men. They were not looked at really as important executives of the company.
So when I was doing I read the audio history of MTV, and I had learned that at the time in the 80s, women mainly worked either in the video department or the PR department at a record company. Like those seemed to be the places where women
Correct.
Were. Yeah. So, but very few were in the A&R department, which is where you were, the path that you followed. So can you talk a little bit about what an A&R rep is and why you chose that?
Sure. An A&R rep is you're responsible for signing acts to the label, working with a staff label in terms of finding songs for them to record if they don't write their own music, finding a producer, managing the budget, everything, helping pick the artwork, the photographers. You're really shepherding in an artist from the soup to nuts. I chose that career only because my secretarial office was across from the head of A&R. And when they used to have the meetings, I would listen to all the men, and they sounded so ridiculous and stupid. I just decided in my own head I could do this job. It was all about going out to clubs, which I love to do anyway, looking at talent. And at the time, when you listen to radio, even though songwriting is complex and means things to the artist, when the record company is done with the song, it's edited down to a certain amount of time that it gets played on the radio. I understood what the formula was to make pop music, which was hit music, which were groups that sold. That, in other words, you didn't have to develop them over 2 or 3 albums. So I would listen to these meetings and I would learn, and I would listen to when Alma would have meetings and Doug Morris, the president of the company, would have meetings, what they were looking for, what they claimed the hit would be. And I just, pushed and pushed till eventually I stumbled upon a group that got signed. And I wound up being the first woman inside the A&R department of Atlantic Records in 40 years at the time. So it was kind of all by accident.
What was that group?
Skid Row.
Oh,
they were
yes.
kind of a heavy metal band of the 90s.
Oh, my. So what are your favorite successes from that time?
They're all, when you have a hit record, like I love them all, but you're not married to any one of them. There is no favorite artist. I worked with many artists, even ones I didn't sign. I just love music. I love artists. I love the whole process of dealing with them and, understanding. There isn't one that stands out special to me.
Are there any bands you wanted to sign that they said no and that they later took off?
Oh, all the time. Creed was one. Probably the biggest one was Creed because that was a Diamond awarded artist. I think there's only like 30 groups that ever sold 10 million copies on the first round out, and that was one of them. So that happens to every single A&R person because at the end of the day, you don't make the decision unless you're the president of the company or the chairman of the company, and it's just really a hazard of the job. It doesn't make it any easier, but it does hurt when they go on to sell that many records.
Yeah. What is it like to be at that time, to be basically sometimes, I guess, the only woman in the room or the only woman with some kind of power?
Well, I didn't really have it to a man. It was very difficult because you're in a room with men. They were my competition. So, they would band together against you as being the only woman. That is the person we should grow into see if they have leadership qualities to make them, run the company, help become a department head. They didn't look at you like they wanted to just bust at any opportunity, get rid of you and fire you when you, spoke against certain type of, I call it toxic masculinity, certain type of male behaviors where, they're running around pounding their chest like King Kong and just would throw you under a bus, use foul language, touch themselves inappropriate for sex, ask you for threesomes, pull down their pants, totally things that should not be happening in a work environment. Today, I would hope to think if you're the only woman in a department, it's a responsibility of a male executive to grow females into positions where there aren't any. There were so many women in the workforce. We outnumber men all in the population. And in so many other areas, they should use our strengths and our talents, not delete us, teach us nothing. And that's the reason why I wanted to write the book, because, I was deleted so many times and I did have so much potential and I did make money for the corporations. Why did this happen? What is it about me that incited these men to behave that way? Why were the men like it at the time? It's a different type of a generation of man where, they almost resented you for wanting to work. Mm-hmm. And it isn't just wanting to work. I had to work. I wasn't born into a wealthy family like a lot of the guys were that didn't have to go to work every day. They had trust funds to live on. So they just really came after you. You had no feeling of safety. Every day you didn't know what was going to happen. And that's really, how do you grow a career like that? So anything I did to rail against them was really a reaction of trauma that I didn't know at the time. It was just one, really one beating after another psychologically. So, and it was terrible. It was terrible. And then on top of that, when I got fired, they would call when I would ask for a recommendation, they wouldn't recommend me. Oh, she's a troublemaker. She's did this. And for the stupidest things. I mean, I was fired because I didn't want to sit on a guy's lap in a meeting.
Yeah.
Well, that's illegal.
Yeah.
You see women today, you open the newspaper, you see actresses. Michael Weatherly was in the paper today. A woman got 9.5 million. This was unheard of, women even speaking up, because when you did, they closed ranks. It's a very small industry controlled at the time by a certain amount of men, and they crushed you. But, I was undaunted. I didn't succeed in the ways I should have financially, but I got jobs and I got employment, at some of the biggest labels anyway. I would always find a way to get in. I just refused to quit because I felt, why should I quit? These guys should quit.
Right.
So.
Well, you mentioned the income. You mentioned the income disparity. Just how meager your wages were compared to your male cohorts, and just like, how was that okay? And do you think it's better now in the industry?
It's not. Look, it's still going on, except the women are making more money, but the disparity is still there. I would take any male executive at the top and one of the female executives, and I guarantee she's making less. The problem with the whole country, it's not just the music business, there is income disparity. It's income inequality. I mean, at my age, I'm 56 years old. I never have been able to buy my own home. I'm not the only woman who had that happen to them in the music business. I've heard from so many others. They just keep us down and think that it's enough that, working in the music business was exciting and you get to, have an expense account. But meanwhile, the men are on their second and third homes, driving Teslas, Bentleys, and these guys, half of them are just, who even knows what they do?
Right.
It's just ridiculous. And they recycle them into better and better jobs. Very few of people really have talent at the top to run a company. So I think that these new generation of men running the business, they have a responsibility to grow women and pay women for the same jobs as the men, what the men are making. And women also have the additional responsibility of raising a family. Most of these guys are married and they choose to take their wives out of the workplace, which is fine. If the woman doesn't want to work outside her business, but the women are working, raising families, doing everything, and they're being paid less. It's unfair.
Right. Well, and you actually name names in your book. Have you heard from anybody that you've named in the book?
No, you're not going to hear from the people at the top because that puts them in play legally. They know what they did, and they know that they cannot hold up under a deposition if any of them want to come after me. A lot of these people engage not only in immoral behavior, but in illegal behavior.
Right.
So, and that's how they raise their career. So, I've heard from so many people in the music business, current, mostly men. They love the book. Because don't forget, the men are being abused as well, not as badly as the women, but these guys at the top, they abuse the men too because they're on a power trip. It's all about how they use their power. They curse at you. In my case, I was physically assaulted. They sexually assault people. They throw things at people. They act like psychos, and they're given, then they're getting awards at the Grammys. It's just a joke and hypocrisy. And I always wanted to write this book, and I got this book deal in 2017, finally after years, before the Me Too movement, because I knew I'm not the only one. And if I wrote a book, I would hear from others that this happened to, and I have.
I have to say, going back to Michael Weatherly, CBS settled with Elijah Dushku. And I read in the New York Times the story. What was funny is that they willfully gave video of him saying these things to her that were very inappropriate, thinking it would cause them to say, "Oh, nothing, that wasn't so bad," and it actually turned the case for her. Like they were just so full of their own bullshit that they thought that it was okay. Yeah. It's I was very happy for her, but yeah, at CBS, I mean, at all levels, it's a mess.
Yeah. It's a culture that they think at the end of the day, these are not scientists in a lab curing disease. These are people with privileged jobs. It's mostly white male privilege, okay? Sitting around thinking that they could press a button and have a woman come and, be available for sex in the middle of the workday because they're running a corporation. These people are really delusional, and the board of directors of all of these companies need to really get their act together and start showing some morality and treat men like human beings, okay? And it's really, CBS is the worst offender, and this is just the beginning, and the music business hasn't had its really big Me Too moment yet, where we've gotten a real big fish, but it's going to happen, and I believe it's going to happen in 2019 because people are they're reading my book, they're seeing these stories, they're going back into the companies and assets used to pay women off, what were the stories, and women should not be bound by non-disclosure agreements. The women should be allowed to speak even if they receive some type of financial settlement, okay?
Yeah.
Because you know what? It brands the women, and then everybody else, runs away from you.
Right.
So, and it's wrong. People need to work, but they also need to, what about the men? The men are all upset, oh, my name, my reputation. What about the woman's reputation?
So the podcast is called Not Fade Away because we talk about people that are from the music world that are no longer with us, people and events and things like that. And so you mentioned a couple of people I'd love to talk about. One of them being Charlie Minor. I remember his story because I was really addicted to those True Hollywood Stories and City Confidential. And I've seen a couple of shows about him. And he sounds like he was just such a charismatic, fun person. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Sure. Charlie Minor was perhaps the best radio promotion man in the music business. And let me explain what his job was. In those days, to break an artist, radio really was the only tool that you had. So if you got your song played on radio in the prime time, it went on a loop, everybody heard it 10 times a day, you had a hit record. So that was his job. But in those days, really promotion men, we used to call it hookers and drugs. He was the head of the promotion department at A&M Records. So he broke Amy Grant's records, Sting, all of those artists at the time. And he was a character, but he was like a salesman. When you go in and you don't need a car, you walk in a car dealership. If he was selling you something, you'd walk out, you bought a car. He had the ability, what made him great was he could get into your head, and he knew how to manipulate you psychologically to motivate you to do something. So for me, he was a character. He dressed well. He drove a Rolls Royce. Whenever you had dinner with him, he had 20 people. He had the best looking women. He really was like a caricature of what a promotion man would be in the music business. And for me, when I got fired from one job with a hit record on the chart, it was number 2 at Giant Records when Irving Azoff fired me. I was going to quit the music business. I was so depressed because I had just been fired from a job before a few months, and I was really devastated and, was in a depression. And he knew how to motivate me immediately by saying, you're going to let this guy beat you. And it kind of motivated me. Everything clicked in. And he was just one of those people who uplifted you and pushed you. And he knew it's a gift to know how to work people. You either have it or you don't. He was a charismatic guy. And, it was a shame how he died, to be murdered at such a young age by, somebody who was really screwed up on drugs. It's an example of how out of control, gun laws are in the country. Because if you weren't able to get a gun in California, he'd probably still be here. This woman is still in prison all of these years, 23 years later. And I don't really think that he was the type of guy that would want her whole life spent in a prison cell, even for murdering him. He was all about second chances, and it's a tragedy all the way around.
Well, I'll be sure to include the show notes, one of those episodes if I can find it. And I was going to ask you that if she was still in jail because he was killed in March of 1995.
Still in prison.
Ah, wow.
Yeah. And she was a young girl, who was high on drugs. And eventually, when you go to jail, you detox, and then you realize you're spending your life for a life. And it's another thing that's wrong too, but I really believe if you didn't have gun control, if it was harder to get a gun, that was another example of out of control gun laws. She bought a gun illegally and killed him.
And then the other person I wanted to talk about was Michael Hutchence. You two had a relationship. What was he like?
He's a very charismatic, fun guy who, obviously very physically handsome. Just a fun, creative person. And he was, loved women and believed in women. And, for me personally, he hated a lot of the guys at Atlantic because he saw the way that they acted. And, he didn't treat anybody like that. He was very generous, gave to a lot of charities, gave to a lot of people. He'd walk down the street. If he saw somebody homeless, he would give them cash, and a lot of cash. A brilliant songwriter, fun, and just really a guy that enjoyed life and was happy all the time. And the way for him to kill himself was such a shame. But we didn't know it at the time. He had a brain injury. And now with all the medical science, you see like the football players, he had multiple concussions for like a 3-year period. And when he had these concussions, his personality began to change, and he became short-tempered. He would have outbursts of crying, a lot of pain. He would touch his head all the time. And he was very sensitive to light, sensitive to sound, and he was still performing and recording, and that probably was the worst thing. It just made it 10 times worse, the physical pain he was in. And even going to doctor, to hear a doctor tell you, I can't help you, is very devastating. So he went on Prozac and just started to spiral down because he was in, a lot of physical pain, and turned to drinking and drugs and, killed himself one night.
When was the last time you had spoken to him?
Probably almost a year before it happened. I ran into him in London, and he looked very puffy. And just was unhappy. And that was a terrible thing, to see. And it was very devastating. When somebody commits suicide that and they're also very close to your age, it's very shocking, because when you're young, you don't think you're ever going to die. You don't even think about death, or at least I never did. And to see somebody so talented and somebody who was just so alive all the time. Back then, I didn't characterize myself as a happy person. Not that I was depressed, but the pressure, of the work was so great for me. I was always under stress. He never had that stress. He enjoyed his career. It was something he thought he was born to do. And, he just loved songwriting and making people happy.
Do you have a favorite In Excess song?
I like the song. I think my favorite one is Beautiful Girl.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, so, that was the story on him. And he was just another funny character out there.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you about the HBO show Vinyl. And my next door, my friend and I, we talk about shows a lot. And this is one of those shows. It was supposedly about the rock and roll industry. Executive produced by, I believe, Mick Jagger and Martin Scorsese and a bunch of other people. And I wanted to like it because that would be my jam. And by episode 2, I just couldn't take it. I just thought the show was terrible and sexist and misogynistic. And I just wanted to I think, didn't you say you were in touch with the producers and they basically stole your story?
Well, it isn't. What really wasn't my story, but the character, the Juno Temple character of the
Yeah.
secretary that wanted to do A&R. Yes, I had a conversation with one of the producers about me because I had showed him some of my book, and of course, that character, the blonde, and to me, it was kind of coincidental. I think the problem with vinyl is, one, Martin Scorsese, he does everything that it's just not realistic,
Hmm.
even in his movies. And the other thing is Mick Jagger. The perspective of an artist in a record company is much different than the reality of what happens. When artists come in, everybody treats them great. It's like celebrity. It's just a cult of celebrity. Nobody's going to treat you like shit if you're producing money for the company. So their perspective is a lot different. It's not going to be realistic. It's not going to tell the truth because they don't really know the truth. How these men, at least at Atlantic Records, behaved worse than any artists in the heyday. So I think the problem with vinyl was you had all these celebrity, people together trying to string what a story, and it's not an accurate reflection. Positively, and it gives me great pleasure, is that I told the truth, not just about the men, but also about my own feelings and my own, you know, failings and shortcomings and my own, temptations and the way I acted morally. Um, and the things that bother me, it's believable. And I think that when you write a book like this, you have to tell the truth. Because for me to just walk in and say, oh, with that guy and he was married, or I threw this guy under the bus, or I planted a story about that guy, to just walk in and say I was innocent and I wasn't a part of the culture, it's just not authentic. And people feel like, well, I just wasted my money on that.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to do that. I felt that my own path down a rabbit hole and the people that I helped continue this type of thing because I was getting something out of it, it is an important story to tell, and I didn't want to be portrayed as a victim. So, I think that that's important too. And vinyl didn't tell the truth. And when you don't tell the truth, people, they get it.
Yep. Absolutely. So what would be your advice to, let's say you just met somebody who just graduated college, male or female, whatever, and they told you, I really want to work in the music industry. What would be your advice to them?
Well, first, to get into the music industry, it's not like you get in through filling out an application in a company. My advice would be if that's something that you want to do, I would go to like events where I know that people in the industry now, the tech companies are in the music business where we didn't have that when I was in it. So like Spotify has events and like, for instance, last night I saw Spotify had an event in Chicago that Kane Brown was performing at. So I would try to get into that event somehow, figure it out. And then I would try to meet as many people as I could connected, whether it's the managers, the bookers, the Spotify people. And I would just try to get a foot in the door. And if I met somebody, I would get their email and I would just contact them and, ask them for a meet and get it until I figured out what I wanted to do. But you have to have kind of an idea of what you want to do. And then you have to take a job starting at the bottom. A lot of the problem with millennials that I see, they all think they're going to be, walking into the executive suite. It doesn't happen that way, even with, 20 degrees from whatever school. You have to start at the bottom, and the bottom is where you learn, the business and decide an area that you want to go into and then go from there. But you have to have a foot in the door somewhere. So
Yeah.
that's my advice.
Do you have any regrets at all about your career?
Um, you know, I would say I have mixed feelings. I don't like to really have regret because all of that, the things that I went through at the time, I turned them into a book. So I don't really have the regrets. I wouldn't have the book. Sometimes when I talk to the guys that have succeeded into the chairman positions that I started out with, I often wonder, gee, if had I not met Ahmet Erdogan, maybe if I had a different type of a boss and started out in a different place other than Atlantic, maybe that could have been me, if I was brought up and taught differently. But then again, like I said, I'd rather have the book and my own story and be the captain of my own ship than, when I see the guys now, the pressure that they're under because the business kind of cannibalized itself.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's just coming back into where it's, making money through streaming, so I try to live with that regret. Let's put it that way. I think that's a tough way to live.
Right. And so what are you up to these days?
Well, right now I'm just concentrating on promoting my book and, doing next year I'm going to be doing some speaking gigs at colleges and some other events. And really that's what I'm doing, concentrating on, speaking around my book and promoting my book. And I do still have a PR company and work with clients. I'm doing my book, which is doing very well considering, I've never written a book before. So you get book companies kind of are like record companies. You have to, if you didn't write a book before, you get limited amount of resources. And I'm with a mid-level book company. I'm not with one of the major book companies. So it takes a minute, even though I've been blessed that I've gotten good reviews on my book. But it's not like, they ask you to come to a bookstore. You really have to do every single thing on your own. So it's time consuming. I love it because I'm learning about a new thing, writing a book and how booksellers work and all of that. But I'm looking forward to speaking, to young men and women about workplace abuse and how you grow a career properly. And also letting the men in the music business hear my voice and say, you have to step up now and grow women into positions. Because for 30 years, you had Doug Morris running all 3 of the major labels. It never occurred to him to take a woman at the corporate level, not at an operating company, but at the corporate level to take his job. We have 3 men now running the major labels and no woman in a 30-year span since I started. And I say that that's wrong. So it's up to some of these men now to step up their game.
And lastly, please tell us where we can find you, where people can get in touch with you.
Oh, I have a website for my book. It's called Anything for a Hit Book, and there's a Gmail address on there. And I answer all my emails, or if you get in touch with me on social media, I answer everybody that's contacted me. I'm thrilled to hear from you, and I answer. And I thank everyone for reading my book and sending me comments. I love hearing from people.
What's your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is D Carvello.
I'm sorry, you broke up there. Can you say your Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram again, please?
It's all D Carvello.
Fantastic. And thank you.
Yeah, it's all D Carvello.
D Carvello. Dorothy, thank you so much for being on my show. I really appreciate it. And once again, I loved your book. I read it, like I said, in one sitting. It's must read, you guys. Anything for a Hit, an A&R woman's story of surviving the music industry. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Not Fade Away podcast. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love what you hear, yay, please leave a review. It helps us so much more than you could ever know. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Not Fade Away Podcast. You can email us with comments or suggestions to notfadeawaypodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to learn more about my other shows, Book vs. Movie, The Fit Bottom Girls, and the Best Neighbors podcast, just follow me at Brooklyn Fit Chick on all social media or check out my main blog, brooklynfitchick.com.